Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of September 2024, and there were 28 of them that I was able to finish this month, and some really good ones in the stack. So to kick us off, I started out by reading a book called Blitz, which is the second book in the Treasure State Wildcat series by Devney Perry. I have been slowly working my way through the backlist of Devney Perry. There's a series she has called The Edens, which I really enjoyed. It's kind of a mix of like romance and suspense. And there are several other series that she has that I haven't gotten to yet. So this is one of them. It's one of her more recent ones. And the series takes place in kind of, there's like a football theme. It's in a college setting. And in this particular book, and I want to make sure I'm not mixing it up with the first book in the series. Okay, so this is about a student and a coach who meet each other because they live in the same neighborhood. And they end up having kind of like a one-night stand. And then they want to have a relationship with each other, but there are rules against students and coaches having a relationship, and they start to kind of try to navigate their feelings for each other around those rules. So I would say of the two that I've read so far, I did like the first book better, and I'm interested in reading the third book in the series. I continue to just enjoy how Devney Perry sets up not just kind of the main characters and the romances within these books, but kind of the characters that are around them as well. The second book that I picked up is a book called Laziness Does Not Exist by Devon Price. Now, I had read another book by Devon Price called Unmasking Autism and really enjoyed it. And this is a book where basically the author argues about how we have what she calls, there's a laziness lie, which basically tells us that we're never working hard enough. And this is one of those books that I find to be really compelling and interesting because I do think we often overwork ourselves and we are getting into situations where nothing is ever enough and we don't give ourselves enough rest and recovery and reset time. And so I really did enjoy this one as well. I think that they've done a fantastic job of, making the case about the laziness lie and how they've kind of set up different examples within this book. The next book I read is one called Everything We Keep. This is by Carrie Lonsdale, and this is the first book in the Everything series. This is basically a book about a woman who her fiance goes missing and is presumed dead. And then she kind of goes on this journey to maybe find him. Like she gets information that maybe he is not deceased. And so she kind of tries to both like move on with her life following, what she thinks is his death, but also kind of holds out hope that he is not dead. I won't go into any spoilers of like, does she find him? Does she not find him? But what I will say is there are elements of this book that are highly unbelievable. And I had a hard time sticking with it for that reason. And I think that, I don't know that I would go further in this particular series. Always glad to pick up a book and just try it out. But there were elements of this book that I found to be a little bit fantastical. Okay. The box set challenge that I had for this particular month was the Wolves of Mercy Falls series by Maggie Stiefvater. And this particular series, I actually looked up the dates because it's basically a series about werewolves and teenagers who are kind of turned into werewolves and they're in relationships with other werewolves and humans. And I looked up the dates because what this really felt like to me was kind of like people who were Team Jacob in the Twilight kind of era. This was like for those people who were really wanting Team Jacob, because Jacob in Twilight, if you were unaware, is a werewolf. And I think that when I first started reading it, I was like, oh, this reads to me like not necessarily fan fiction, but the way it starts out is got this kind of like teenage love relationships, and then it kind of, I think as it goes along in terms of the box set, it gets further and further away from like the initial plot of what's happening in book one. Similar to other YA box sets that I've read, I can't say that I recommend this one. I think that I was hoping for something that would have, to be honest, a little bit of a Twilight feel, but would be a little bit better than Twilight, because I think Twilight's the series quality is kind of tough. I love the story part, but like the writing part is a little bit hard for me. And with this particular series, it wasn't much better. So I'm sorry to say that. But I did read all four, and glad that I was able to check that off my list. The next book that I picked up is a book called Recalculating: Navigate Your Career Through the Changing World of Work. This is by Lindsay Pollock. And for this particular book, what I appreciated about it, and I've got a bunch of books out from the library, my physical library right now, that are about like career and the gig economy and portfolio careers, and like there's just a number of different books in this category, and I would put this book squarely within that, of thinking about how the work world is changing, how are you kind of pivoting to meet the challenges of like the contemporary work world. And so this is basically talking about post COVID-19, there are a lot of changes, and how are you kind of meeting those changes. I did find this book to be kind of helpful and interesting, but I will say it didn't necessarily stand out to me from a number of other books that are in this genre. But I did feel like it was well written. I did feel like it was giving a lot of different insights from like different experts in the field, like talking about different things that might require a pivot in the workplace. So if you're looking for something in this area, I could recommend it, but I think there's a number of books that are kind of checking the same box, around that topic. Okay, next up I read The Personal MBA by Josh Kaufman. And this is a book that I've dipped in and out of for quite some time. I think it started out as a blog and then it was made into a book. And basically what Josh Kaufman does is take individual terms that would be covered in like an MBA program that help you to understand business, and he like fleshes them out. And it's almost like a little bit like an encyclopedia, but it's not alphabetical. He has it kind of categorized into different sub-themes, and then you can kind of learn about like marketing, for example, and he like walks through all this terminology. I actually found this book to be incredibly interesting and helpful for people who are just getting started with running a business. There were many entries here that I thought I learned, something about. And I've been running my own business now for 9 years. So it's been a while, that I've been doing that. But I've been wanting to read this book in full for a long time. I did read the audio, but I found it helpful to have the physical copy in front of me as well, just because the sections of the book are relatively small and it can be easy to kind of like miss something if you're not really paying attention, as you're listening and reading at the same time. Okay, then I picked up a book called The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. This is a book that I have been hearing a ton about. It is basically about a missing child from a summer camp, and the missing child has this like connection to another missing child from decades before who also went missing, and there's obviously connection between this. This is kind of like a family, I would call it a suburban drama, but it doesn't take place in the suburbs. I mean, it's clearly in this like rural place next to this summer camp, but it has that kind of drama element of there's different families involved. You're not quite sure what's going on. It's like a little bit of suspense. It's definitely a genre mashup. I mean, I would say that. And I've seen a lot of people say that they have read this book and like not been able to put it down. I will say that I didn't have that experience with it. I was kind of dipping in and out of it. I didn't feel like I was completely sucked in, to this particular book. But I thought it was incredibly well written. It has a very literary feel to it, and I could absolutely recommend it. I thought the ending was also really interesting. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit, I would say it's got like a bit of a spooky feel to it as well, you could definitely pick this up. Okay, then I read the first book in the Sword of Shannara series, and this is by Terry Brooks. I'm going to call it The Sword of Shannara, despite the fact that Shannara is not pronounced that way in the audiobook, but I have only ever heard it pronounced Shannara, and I don't know how else to say it. So I'm going to call it The Sword of Shannara. Recognize that if you listen to the audiobook, they may call it something different. But basically, the first book in this trilogy, and it goes on to be a longer series, but there's like an original trilogy, which I got to the first 2 books this month. So we'll talk about the second one as well. The first book in the trilogy is very, very similar to like a quest narrative that you would see from Tolkien. And to the point where you feel like the characters are just being copied. You feel like there are scenes in the book that are just being copied. And when the original first book for this came out, a lot of people said, this is for fans of Tolkien. Like there is a very direct connection. Now, I will also say, having read the Wheel of Time series, that the first book in that series is also very similar to what you see from Tolkien. It's like they for the first book, they have to like copy it. I don't know. to me, it feels like a very direct copy. Like there are characters that are just like matches. Like you could just match them up from one book to another. It's still enjoyable. It's still interesting. It's still, relatively easy to follow because it's a quest narrative. They're trying to, get from one place to another. They run into all of these obstacles along the way. I mean, like all the things that you can remember from like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Like it's very similar in that regard. So when I read the first book, I had forgotten everything about this. I had read this when I was a child, in I think like the 5th grade. I had entered into this series. So I'd forgotten everything. So it was fun to revisit it. I did enjoy that. Everything I read said that the second book is one that people enjoy more in the series. So the second book, which I read at the very tail end of the month, but I'll talk about it now, is called The Elfstones of Shannara. And this is basically a story about there's like this tree that provides protection to the elves, who are a population that are, in the book. And I think the tree may provide protection beyond the elves, but it's kind of tied to them. And what happens is the tree begins to die. And there's this process that needs to happen to like save the tree or like allow the tree to like kind of be like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Like it needs to kind of like reinvigorate itself. And there's a journey that has to happen. So this is another journey quest book. And there are 2 characters who are sent on this journey. The first male main character is connected to the male main character from book 1. And then there's a female main character who goes along with him on this journey. Some people have said they really don't like the ending of book 2. I loved the ending of book 2. I think it's a wonderful way to end that particular book. And I'm actually looking forward to book 3. I just ran out of time to get to it in September. But I think these are really fun. I mean, if you like high fantasy and you like these kinds of quest narratives and just like really fun, whimsical characters, I could definitely recommend this, especially if you haven't picked it up before and you just want to try something new. All right. The next book I read was one that I'd actually picked up for work. It is called The AI Savvy Leader, and obviously is about artificial intelligence. This is by David D. Kramer. And this is a book that I think the subtitle is not great. It's called 9 Ways to Take Back Control and Make AI Work. And it implies like that concept of like taking back control. When I read that, I was like, what is this even about? Like, and what I found is I wish it had a different subtitle, because I think the subtitle is not a good representation of what the book actually is. This is a book that basically says, if you are a leader and you are trying to understand and kind of incorporate AI into the workplace, you need to have certain kinds of characteristics. You need to be open to learning. You need to be open to like collaboration and engaging with teams. Like it's got like specific principles that it's building off of to say, to be AI savvy, you need to kind of like embody these kinds of characteristics, which feels very different than like taking back control. So I would just say, don't be put off by the subtitle. I think this is interesting. Having read other things about AI and just given it, a decent amount of thought in my own, career and what I'm doing in my job, I don't know that I learned a ton from this, but I think it's a good starting point, and it could maybe be like an interesting book group book if you had a group of leaders like wanting to talk about it together. Okay, the next book that I read is one called All That We Never Were by Alice Kellen. This is a book that I'm pretty sure, at least by the accents in the audiobook, I think it takes place in Australia or New Zealand. It's not mentioned in the description itself, but when I was reading it, it was clearly accented in the audiobook. And this is basically about a teenager who has gone through kind of a traumatic experience. She's grieving, she's trying to come out of it, and she has a good relationship with her older brother, and her older brother has to leave town for work. And so he says to his like best friend, will you take care of her, while I'm going away? Because there isn't anyone else to kind of keep an eye on her. And so she moves in with this best friend. And it turns out that she has been like in love with this best friend for many, many years, like since she was a young child. And they begin to engage in a relationship. What is interesting about this situation is, and the brother's best friend is definitely like a romance trope. And so you see it in this particular book for sure, is there's a lot of concern that like, I think there's like an age difference concern. There's also a concern that she's a little bit fragile, because of just her current state. But there's a lot of kind of eventually like questioning of their relationship and if it's like healthy and if it's a good relationship. I won't say what the ending is, but I will say there is a sequel to this book. I'm not sure I'll read the sequel. I just wasn't super invested in this particular relationship of these two characters, and I wasn't able to kind of click into it. And so I'm not sure that I will continue reading it, but this is an author I hadn't read before, so I'm glad I picked it up for that reason. All right, the next book that I read is one called Unwanted by Mia Sheridan. It is the first book in a series called Men and Monsters. This is a book that is based on the Tarzan narrative, which is what sucked me in the beginning because I was kind of curious about how this would go. And I will say I found it to be incredibly compelling. There are things in here that are not believable. You have to kind of like set aside, reality a little bit. But basically this is the story of a man who is living in the wilderness in like a cabin. And he gets caught up there's a murder of like a neighbor, of somebody who lives close to him. And what we end up finding out, and I don't think this is a spoiler, is that this man has been in this cabin since he was a child, like 8 years old, or maybe like 7 years old. And he has had to survive in the wilderness by himself with a little bit of help from this neighbor guy who got murdered. There is a whole backstory as to why he was there and like why he was allowed to basically be on his own, and he was lied to about like the world being at war, and like, I mean, he felt like he had to isolate himself, to survive. Then there's the female main character, the Jane equivalent, who is tied to this kind of rural area. She gives like tours and things like that. And she ends up starting to develop like a friendship with this man who's been living out in the woods on his own. And all kinds of things happen from there. There ends up being like a synchronicity to their stories, because she also grows up and is like in the foster care system. I actually really liked this book and kind of how all the storylines came together. Like I said, you have to suspend reality a little bit, but I thought it was really interesting, and there are certain kinds of elements about his life in particular and how he's kind of like trying to live and survive in the wilderness that I thought were really, really interesting. Okay, the next book I read is one called Among the Lesser Gods by Margot Katz. This I would call literary fiction, and it's basically about this woman who moves to a town in Colorado and is basically like coming into this smaller town community and like learning about the relationships in this community. And there's also this kind of backstory in this book about a missing woman, and like we eventually find out kind of what happened to this woman. And I actually I feel like some of the reviews for this book weren't always positive, although it's rated pretty well on Goodreads. It's got over 4 stars. I actually really liked it. I thought the character development was well done. I thought the plot development was well paced. This is a book that I would say it's definitely not fast paced, but it keeps you going, and it keeps you engaged throughout. And you are kind of invested in the characters, and you want to know like what happens over time with this community and how they're all engaging with each other. All right, next I read a book called Abducted. This is the first book in the Lizzie Gardner series by T.R. Reagan. And this is basically a book about a woman who is abducted, then who gets away from her captor. And then years later, this person kind of surfaces again and is abducting people again. And she gets brought in by like the FBI to try to find this person, and figure out who it is. And obviously the killer is like targeting, this woman who got away. I found this book to be interesting. Like I was interested in the storyline. I wanted to know what was going to happen. Again, like with books that are kind of just like straight up thrillers, I need a little something for it to be like set apart, for it to be, special in any kind of way. And with this particular one, like I thought it was fine. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was, well paced, well written, that all was fine. but there wasn't anything kind of like unique about it that would like suck me in and make me want to read multiple books. And I guess the example I would give, which I think I've given in previous videos, is like The Silence of the Lambs is compelling. I mean, like if you read that book, and of course, you know, you may have seen the film as well, you are completely immersed in like what is happening in that thriller. And it doesn't always feel that way in some of these other thrillers. It feels like they're just kind of like throwaways a little bit. Like the author wrote it relatively quickly and it's part of a big series, and it's not necessarily something that has like a lot of meat to it. And I would say this one kind of fell into that category for me. All right, the next book that I picked up is one called And Now You're Back. This is by Jill Mansell. And basically this is the story about two teenagers who have a relationship, and then they kind of go their separate ways for a reason that gets kind of unveiled, you know, in the story of the book. But then later on when they're adults, one of them is like working in this kind of like hotel, and the other one comes back and has to stay in the hotel, and they begin to engage with each other again, you know, as adults. And I thought this book was really charming. Like this would be a great book to read like around the holidays. It's not necessarily set as like a holiday book, but it has a lot of warmth to it in terms of how the characters are interacting with each other, what they're learning about themselves. There's this like found family component that I really enjoyed. And so this is one that I would recommend. I thought it was pretty solid. And I don't know that I've read this author before, so I did enjoy picking that one up. So the next book I read is a book called Some Choose Darkness by Charlie Donley. And this is a book, I've been kind of like working through the backlist of Charlie Donley because there are several that I've read that, as I was mentioning before about the thrillers, these have this like unique component to them. And they typically have like a really unique plot twist, or they have something that's just really sucking me in. The story of this one is basically there's a woman whose father dies, and he is a lawyer. And when he dies, she is like going through his files, and she finds some mysterious things about this man that he's been like defending over a period of time. And the man that he's been defending is about to get out of prison. Like he's been in prison, the father's been going through all these appeals and different things, and the man is about to get out of prison. And now she has to kind of take over the case and help him like reintegrate into society, basically. And this is a man that was accused of killing his wife and maybe killing some other women as well. He's kind of like a serial killer character. And there are a lot of really interesting elements to this book in terms of like things that are unveiled at different points that just kind of add layers of complexity to what you're learning about like the main character, the female main character, and this man who's like got out of prison, her family. It kind of goes back and forth in time. You also get a little bit more information about this man's wife that he was accused of killing. So there's some really like fun depth to this book. I would highly recommend it. I mean, Charlie Donley in general, I think I would highly recommend. I have not gone wrong yet with a Charlie Donley book. They're all very interesting, and there's a lot of like unique elements to them that I don't always see coming. Okay, next I read a book called The Advantage. This is by Patrick Lencioni. And Patrick Lencioni, you may have known from another book he wrote called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which I think is very popular. This is a book on organizational health. It's about 220-ish pages, so relatively quick read. I think I read it in like an afternoon. I found it to be highly practical, highly applicable to my current situation at work. There were a lot of things that I took away that I really enjoyed in terms of principles of how he's defining organizational health and how leaders and teams need to work together to encourage it. This is one that actually a friend and colleague had recommended to me, and I can see why, and I would recommend it too. So I think if you're in a leadership role or if you're on a leadership team, this is definitely one that I would consider picking up. After that, I picked up a book called ADHD 2.0 by Edward Hallowell. I have read several other books by Edward Hallowell at this point. He is kind of an expert on ADHD. He also has ADHD. And I am just continuing to work my way through a number of books on neurodiversity. I would say at this point, I've probably read about 20 of them this year. It was one of the kind of side projects that I've been working on for a course that I'm developing related to my coaching training business. And so this one, I continue to find his work to be very practical. I like the examples that he offers. He's very good about explaining the science of attention disorders. And so this is one I could recommend. I would recommend his other books as well. The next book that I read is one that I had started in a previous month, and then I had to return the book to the library, and I was able to get the audio. It is called Scattered Minds by Gabor Mate, and this is about subtitled The Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder. What's interesting about Gabor Mate is this author takes a view that is different than some other authors I've read. Most authors agree, and most scientists agree, from what I can tell, that ADHD is an inherited disease. It is something that you are very likely, or you are more likely to have an attention disorder if someone in your family has an attention disorder, if one of your siblings or your parents or something along those lines has this. And what Gabor Mate argues is that, yes, that may be true, but there are also cultural factors that if you grow up in particular kinds of environments or you have particular kinds of experiences, including things like trauma, you are more likely to have ADHD. And it's not just genetic, it's like these other elements as well. And I thought that was interesting. Gabor Mate does identify as having ADHD. There are other members of this author's family who have it as well. And so I think that there's some like interesting layers here, to what this author is kind of bringing to the conversation. And I appreciated reading this because I had read about this author in other books on ADHD, but had not actually read any of their work directly. All right, so then I read a book called Unravel Me. This is the third book in the Playing for Keeps series by Becca Mack. Becca Mack is quickly becoming a new favorite romance author for me. She has written a series. I read the first two books, I think last month or last couple of months. And then this is the third book. There's a fourth book I'll get to soon as well. It's basically a series about a group of hockey players that have this like found family where they all really care about each other, and they're coming into kind of adulthood together basically, and they're starting to form these relationships. The first book is about kind of this like playboy character and how he gets he falls in love basically with someone for the first time, and he's never been in a relationship, and so you get to kind of see that. The second book is about one of his teammates and his sister. The main character in the first book, his sister, is in a relationship with one of the main character's teammates. I don't know if I explained that well, but it's a brother's best friend kind of trope, and so they have a relationship. And then in the third book, there is another teammate on this hockey team who in the first book is breaks up with his girlfriend and is kind of traumatized by that experience, and then he finds a woman who he begins a relationship with in this third book. And in the third book, the woman he ends up falling for happens to have a child. She's a single mother, and so there's a whole element there that is kind of explored in the third book. I really like all three of these books. I think what I would say is, depending on the level of spice, that you're kind of interested in, there's a decent amount of spice in these books. And some people, I think, avoid that, or they want to have like a closed door, romance. This is not that. There is definitely spice. So just be aware of that if you're picking up this series. But I love the found family relationships in this series, and the way the teammates interact with each other and support each other is a really cool element as well. Okay, next up I read Taming Seven, which is the fifth book in the Boys of Tommen series by Chloe Walsh. This is the last book that is currently out, although I think that there are more books in the series that could be coming. And this is a series I have talked about at length in other videos. It is basically a group of teenagers in Ireland who are having different relationships. The first two books are about one pairing. The second two books after that, so books 3 and 4, are about another couple. And this fifth book is a standalone about a third couple. And what I will say is read the trigger warnings before you go into this book, because there are some things that I don't want to give away spoilers. I picked up pretty quickly what was going on, relatively early in the book. I'm not sure how obvious it was or if I just happened to pick it up. But there are some trigger warnings here that I would be a little bit cautious about. And this is, I think, another book that, again, I was completely sucked in. I'm sucked into every book in this series. I would highly recommend the series, but this book may be more, well, I don't know. The first couple books, I would say there's definitely a domestic violence trigger warning. The third and the fourth book, there's definitely kind of a addiction trigger warning. And I think that to give the trigger warning of book 5 would be a bit of a spoiler. So I would just say look that up if you are wanting to know what that is. But the relationship between the male main character and the female main character is very sweet. And it's definitely kind of like a will they, won't they, like finally get together. And I really did love, you know, how this book came together. I would absolutely read more books in this series. All right, then I read a book called Dear Daughter. This is by Elizabeth Little. I randomly came across this in my library, digital library with my public library through the Libby app when I was searching for something else, and this kind of popped up and I thought it looked interesting. It's basically the story of this woman who's a socialite, and then she is accused and convicted of killing her mother, goes to prison, gets out of prison, and then like goes on this journey to find out what really happened the night her mother died, because she can't really remember and she's not sure if she really killed her or not. This is another one of those books that you have to suspend a lot to really believe what's going on. There's a lot of things that are not super realistic in terms of just following along. It was interesting. I mean, I think there were some things I wasn't expecting. You know, there's an ending that is, you know, a little bit twisty. I did end up rating this like 3 out of 5 stars. Like it was just kind of okay for me. It was a little bit ho-hum. So I don't know that I can like highly recommend that one. It fell into, I don't know, like a basket of just like books that will probably not be memorable for me in terms of that thriller genre. And then the last 3 books of the month that I picked up are all 3 books in the trilogy of The War of Lost Hearts by Carissa Broadbent. This includes Daughter of No Worlds, Children of Fallen Gods, and Mother of Death and Dawn. I read the first book in this series, which is basically about a woman who's a former slave, and relatively quickly, I don't think this is a spoiler, she basically kills the person who is her master of her being a slave, and then runs away to try to get training in magic so that she can go back and save other people from like her home country. And she gets paired up with this guy who's like a teacher named Maxentarius, and she ends up like living with him as like an apprentice, and he's training her in this magic. The first book, like as is common with these trilogies, the first book, the second book, and the third book, there's a massive shift of what happens with these characters, and I can't really explain it because it's just way too many spoilers. But what I will say is I started reading book 2, and the first half I was just kind of like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like first book was interesting. It's world building. You're getting to know the characters. You're kind of understanding what's going on. And I thought book 1 was fine. Got into book 2 and I was like, I'm not sure this is like holding my attention. Then I got to like the halfway point of book 2 and it like took off, and I knew exactly what was going on. I was like completely sucked in, and then I really enjoyed book 3. So I feel like there's this like, maybe it was just me, but there's this like lull that happens in the beginning of book 2. And that if you can just stick through it, I think it's worth it to read the entire trilogy. This is a trilogy that I could see some people like rereading because it's got some nice depth to it. There's a lot of details. The magic systems are really interesting. I don't know that I will necessarily read it again, but I can definitely see why people like it. And this is the second series I've read from this author, and I've been really enjoying her work. So those are the 28 books that I read in September of 2024. And as I said, some really good ones in here. I'm really looking forward to my next month of reading as well. So stay tuned for my October TBR video, which will be on the channel soon. And until then, happy reading.